Hello YouTube. So, you've seen the title of this video. What if you, a human on Tamriel, fall in love with an Argonian, or any non-human race really, so elf or Khajiit? Well, that question was inspired by a request from my Patreon member Hist Soul, who wanted to know the lore around inter-race couples on Tamriel. How does it work? What do the people of Tamriel think of you? Well, those are the questions that we're going to answer today in this video. So, let's roll the intro and let's talk about it. So, inter-race couples, Argonians that fall in love with humans, an orc that falls in love with a Khajiit, a high elf falling in love with a dark elf. It happens. We have quite a lot of examples of inter-race couples on Tamriel throughout the different games, with them being quite rare in some games and relatively common in others. While in Daggerfall they were quite rare, starting with Morrowind and Oblivion we started to see a lot more of them, and now in Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls Online they are quite common. Now, if I had to guess the exact percentage of inter-race couples compared to intra-race, so that's couples of the same race, I think we're looking at something like 3 to 5% of the romantic couples. Maybe a bit higher in the Elder Scrolls Online, and a bit lower in the other games. Still quite low, but common enough to encounter a couple of them during your playthroughs. Now, in terms of the lore, let's first start with the question of compatibility. While a romantic relationship is certainly possible at all times, as each of the playable races, and some of the non-playable races as well, such as the Sea Elves, are intelligent and are able to form emotional bonds, the question is whether or not a mixed race couple can have offspring, so children, which continue the line. And the answer is yes, in some cases. While the lore isn't super clear, we know that for certain two races of humans, so let's say a Breton and an Imperial or a Nord and a Redguard, can procreate without any issues. Just as we know that two races of elves, so High Elves and Dark Elves for example, or a Wood Elf and an Orc, who are a race of elf, can also procreate without any issues. Now, past that it gets a little bit more complicated, as we know that the human races and the races of elves are compatible with each other, but the fertility rate of these couples seems to be slightly lower than intra-race couples. So the chance of offspring being created out of intercourse is slightly lower in these couples, but it's still very much possible. And then we've got the Khajiit. Now, it's very unclear from the lore exactly what their deal is in this equation. It's been suggested that it's possible that certain Khajiit types, specifically those who kinda look like elves, see my Khajiit video for more information on the different types of Khajiit and this type of Khajiit, may be able to procreate with elves, maybe even the cat-like Khajiit. But offspring seems quite rare with Khajiit-elf couples. Not impossible, but just very rare. So that would indicate that it's a very low fertility for such couples, and like I said, the type of Khajiit likely matters here. And then in terms of Argonians, well, they are just completely incompatible biologically, so offspring is really not possible unless in very specific cases where God heavily intervenes. Because that's the only example that we have in the lore where it was possible for an Argonian to procreate with one of the other races. It's in the Shivering Isles with the heavy interference of Sheogorath, so in a place where some of the laws of nature don't really count, with the interference of the creator of said plane. So yeah, Argonians are incompatible. And that's likely because while the Khajiit seems to share some far-off ancestor with the elves and the humans, but are likely a bit closer to elves, which is why elves and Khajiit can procreate and humans and Khajiit apparently not, the Argonians do not share an ancestor with anyone else, as they've been created by the Hist trees to protect them. And as such, they have a completely different creator and are biologically very different, so completely incompatible for procreation. Not for romance, of course, but unless you appeal to Sheogorath, don't expect to have children with an Argonian as any of the other races. Now, one final tidbit of the biology. When two different races have offspring, the rule of thumb is that the child will generally be of the mother's race. There are exceptions, but they are uncommon. Mixed race children isn't really a thing, only under very specific circumstances, such as when there's vampirism involved, does the child seem to inherit racial features of both the father and the mother. Because it seems that some features of a vampire can be inherited even if the mother is not a vampire. Now, that being said, racial features say nothing of your looks. If you're a child of a female high elf with a small nose and an imperial man with a big nose, then generally, while you will most likely be a high elf as a child, it's very possible to be a high elf with a big nose that you inherit from your father. This is even one of the ways in which outward appearance traits, so not innate racial traits like affinity with magicka, but purely outward appearance stuff of one race can start appearing in another race. For example, very conservative Altmer who despise all the other races have very specific beauty standards, as they will really hate human-ish features in a potential partner. For example, elves with humans in their ancestry somewhere seem to have slightly less pointy ears, which are a little bit more rounded. They're still high elves, but they have inherited some outward appearance traits of a human somewhere in their ancestry. Presumably this works the same with humans with elves somewhere in their ancestry having slightly more pointed ears, but those are just examples. Now, what I said earlier about conservative high elves really disliking human features in a partner kind of already spoiled it, but some cultures really don't seem to appreciate interrace couples, for a variety of reasons, because while all cultures on Tamriel seem quite accepting when it comes to romance, with stuff like homosexuality really not being an issue for mostly anyone it seems, interracial couples are a different issue, because some cultures, at least their more conservative population, really do take issue with some interracial couples. And when I say the more conservative populations, I really mean that. In many places, people really don't care what you do. You want to marry Khajiit as a human? Go ahead. Just keep in mind, what I'm about to tell you doesn't apply to everyone on Tamriel, just the conservative ones. Alright? Alright. So, first let's get the simplest stuff out of the way. Interracial human race relationships. They really seem to be a non-issue. You want to marry a Breton or a Redguard as a Nord, nobody cares. Just go ahead, do it. The only way it becomes slightly more complicated is when it comes to political problems. While generally no Nord will care if you marry an Imperial, it might be slightly looked down upon if you marry an Imperial in Stormcloak territory during the Stormcloak Rebellion in Skyrim, or if a Redguard marries an Imperial just after the Great War when they weren't too stoked on the Empire there either. But really, that's not even a racial issue, it's a political issue. Because those same sentiments come about when a Breton marries a Breton from another kingdom, which their kingdom is at war with, so you get the same kind of prejudices at that point, even though the two people are of the same race. So I would say in general, humans among one another, nobody really cares what you do, the only thing is the political part. Even humans with other races, from the human side, it rarely seems to be a problem. Sure, some people might find your romance a bit of a curiosity, especially with one of the Khajiit or Argonians. Some people may have questions, but in general, humans don't really seem to care. I mean, there will be questions, like I said. Like in the Elder Scrolls Online, we have a Nord woman who married a Khajiit who said that she got some questions and even some light warnings of what Khajiit are like before marriage from other humans. Though nobody really seemed to have wanted to actively stop the marriage or want to disinherit her for it or anything like that. But then, when they were married, nobody really cared about it. It's one of those, okay, sure, if you want that, kind of things. Now, the only examples that I could find where humans really weren't too happy with you marrying another race was when it came to royalty, because, for example, in a royal Breton house of kings, it doesn't seem to be appreciated if a male king marries, for example, a Dunmer, because that way it would, over time, become a Dark Elf house if the woman gets Dark Elf children, instead of a Breton house. But even then, it happens. Look for example at Queen Berenzia, who was married to the Breton king Edwire for a while. Although it's important to note here that Edwire already had Breton children from a previous marriage, so maybe that's why it wasn't that big of a deal. While in other cases of royal lineages in both High Rock and Cyrodiil, it is kind of a bigger deal. But, like I said, politics just play a big role for humans. In Hammerfell, for example, in places where the rivalry between the two factions of the province, the Crowns and the Forebears, is the biggest, there's people who would simply rather see you marry a Khajiit than marry someone from the other side. I mean, as a Crown, in those places, you'd better marry an Argonian instead of marrying one of those filthy Forebears. So really, even with the non-human races, race really isn't that much of a problem. It's more about the politics, once more. Now, in Elvish cultures, that's a whole different thing altogether, in some of them at least, because honestly, Bosmer culture, for example, they seem to be pretty similar to the humans in that they really don't seem to care who you marry. Maybe if you, as a traditional Bosmer living in the trees, suddenly marry a city life Imperial, you become a bit of a curiosity, there will be raised eyebrows and questions, and your partner probably would need to accept the ways of the Green Pact if you're to live with that community, but beyond it being a bit of a curiosity, the Bosmer don't really seem to care as long as your relationship doesn't cause any problems for the community when it comes to the Green Pact. Now with the other races of elves, it is a bit more complicated. For one, the orcs. The orcs generally seem to be fine with interracial relationships, however, it seems that at least orc chieftains are expected to marry orcs to make sure that their children are orcs. But beyond that, we don't really have that much information to go on for them. I saw this fun bit of speculation on the internet somewhere, which seemed quite accurate, which basically said, as long as the wife or husband can hold their own in the stronghold, and if the chieftain who marries him or her is strong enough to just squash any outcry over it, people would accept it. And I think that's pretty much the way it goes with the orcs, but we don't really have enough information, so that's just speculation. Now, when it comes to the High Elves and the Dark Elves, they are, or at least their conservative populations, a lot more strict, as both don't really appreciate it if you marry a non-High Elf or a non-Dark Elf. To start with the High Elves, we already established that the more conservative Altmer really don't like human-ish features in a partner, and they don't really appreciate it when you marry a human. But it goes further than that, as marrying a Khajiit, an Orc or an Argonian is a complete no-go in most conservative places, and marrying a Bosmer has literally been called bestiality in the past by some conservative High Elves, so that's also a no-go. We don't have much information on how they view the Dark Elves. Maybe it's a bit more acceptable, as the Dark Elves are seen as a bit more cultured than humans and have a comparable high cultural tradition and similar lifespans to Altmer. So maybe that's a bit more acceptable, but it's still likely heavily frowned upon in traditional Altmer circles, as they really care about keeping the bloodline pure. That being said, it does happen. We have several examples of High Elves marrying non-High Elves. Some of them even were disowned by their traditional family, although in other cases, in less conservative families, it seems to be less of an issue, so it really depends on how traditional the family is. It largely seems to work the same for Dark Elves, as the more conservative Dark Elves tend not to be super happy with it when you marry a non-Dark Elf. Although this has less to do with racial purity, it seems, like with the High Elves, but more with social status. Since the Dark Elves of Morrowind still actively practice slavery, it's generally looked down upon to marry a race which is generally seen as one of the slave races, like Argonians. However, it seems to be less of an issue if the person you marry has a good social status. Like, for example, a Dark Elf marrying a rich Nord trader is likely seen as less of a problem in conservative Dark Elf circles than a Dark Elf marrying a former Nord slave, as people get disowned from their Dark Elf families for that kind of thing. Of course, even with the rich trader there will still be some prejudice in certain circles, but the marriage will generally be accepted far quicker. Honestly, for the High Elves and the Dark Elves as well to a degree, marrying outside of their race simply doesn't happen all that often because of the lifespan issue, because the High Elves or Dark Elves will always live longer in a normal lifespan than their partner. We have some pretty painful examples of human-elf marriages where they married at like 20 years old and the elf is still young, while now the human is around 70 to 80 years old. There are some very concrete examples of elves outliving their human or even Khajiit and Bosmer partners, which is often too much to emotionally handle, which is likely why even in less conservative households it is warned against. Even so, it does happen. We have some perfectly fine examples of mixed marriages where the lifespan thing, while an issue, doesn't stand in the way of true love. That being said, let's now talk about the Argonians. Because the Argonians are a bit curious, as there's a distinct difference between Black Marsh Argonians who grew up in the presence of the Hist, and provincial Argonians who grew up away from the Hist in the other provinces. As the provincial Argonians tend to sometimes marry non-Argonians, while the swamp-dwelling Argonians of Black Marsh seem to almost never do it, with there even being some prejudice against it in Black Marsh to marry non-Argonians, especially since Argonian mating is a very specific process in which other races don't really fit. More on that in my video on love and marriage traditions. Now, for provincial Argonians, it doesn't seem to be that much of an issue. We have some examples of them marrying other races, but beyond that we don't have much information on it. Other than that, even among them there seems to be a bit of a stigma towards Dark Elves because of the whole generations of slavery thing. But even then, Dark Elf and Argonian marriages do happen sometimes. Now, finally we get to the Khajiit, and I hate to disappoint you, but we have very little to no information on their culture. In this regard, it seems to be somewhat accepted, as we even find a Khajiit in the Elder Scrolls Online who gets pushed by his family to marry a Bosmer or High Elf, because of the political situation in the game and all. So, at that point, you would say that points towards it not bringing shame on the family name, so likely it's accepted. And we find several mixed race couples that involve Khajiit, where generally the focus is always on what the other partner's family thinks in the situation, but never really on what the Khajiit's family thinks. So that once again points towards it being quite accepted, but other than that, we don't really know. Sorry about that. And that's basically all that we know about interracial relationships on Tamriel, both the biological and the cultural aspect of it. Thank you to Hist Soul for requesting this video, and I hope that I managed to learn you, the viewer, something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not return for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably next week, and subscribe to the channel, as that really helps me out. Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon subscribers, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Hist Soul, Gabriel Binda, Athena Yodis, Doji, Fenrir, King Chris, Pavel T, Pentam Gwar, Volkir of Argonia, Leo Worley, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen keep this channel alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.